Sprint planning is the longest of the Scrum meetings. Depending on sprint length, some teams will take as long as a full day. And standard Scrum advice is to spend up to 2 hours per week of the sprint. So, from 2 hours to plan a 1-week sprint, up to 8 hours to plan a 4-week sprint. Unfortunately, some teams turn sprint planning into a marathon, lasting even longer than this. Sprint planning should never take longer than a day. And I find that even the advice of 2 hours per week of the sprint is too much for a good experienced team. A good experienced team should strive to finish sprint planning in much closer to just 1 hour per week of the sprint. So, a 2-hour meeting for a 2-week sprint, and a 4-hour meeting for a 4-week sprint. There are 2 general reasons why sprint planning can turn into a marathon. 1, lack of preparation. 2, trying too hard to get it perfect. The first of these, a lack of preparation, is the result of not properly maintaining the product backlog. A product backlog needs maintenance, care and feeding, if you will. You can spend either a little time on the product backlog each sprint, or you can spend a lot of time during one sprint when you discover the backlog is a mess and is not well understood. The type of maintenance I'm referring to here, often called product backlog grooming or refinement, is the subject of its own video in this course. The problem with not being prepared for sprint planning is that the meeting will take a long time because the team will have a lot of questions for the product owner. I've actually seen teams in this situation spend a week on sprint planning. One team I'm thinking about started the sprint planning meeting on Monday morning. In this meeting, it was clear that this was the first time the team had heard of many of the product backlog items, and that many were quite large. After a few hours together, the team and product owner decided to end the meeting and spend the next few days working to understand the top handful of product backlog items. They agreed to reconvene on Friday to finish sprint planning. This team would have been far better off spreading that time across the preceding sprint or two, so that it could have come into sprint planning better prepared. The other reason why sprint planning can turn into a marathon is that a team is trying too hard to get sprint planning perfect. There's no need to be perfect. In fact, there's an optimal amount of time to spend in sprint planning. Here we see a graph showing how well a sprint is planned based on how much time is spent in the sprint planning meeting. Spend too little, and the sprint will be poorly planned. This will also lead to the wrong amount of work being brought into the sprint, either too much or too little, and that will lead to problems during the sprint. Spending too much time in a sprint planning meeting, however, is just as inefficient. Going into too much detail with each product backlog item or trying to estimate too precisely wastes the time of all team members without adding value to the sprint. The goal is to be right here in the optimal area. Imagine this scenario. As a Scrum Master, you run a sprint planning meeting as you normally would. At the end of the meeting, you have a sprint backlog, a set of tasks, and an estimate to go with each task. But you know the team didn't think of everything. So you tell them to stay in the room for another hour, just silently thinking as hard as they can. At the end of the hour, you ask what they came up with. Together, they've identified another 5 tasks. That's great, you think. The sprint is now better planned. But you know it's still not perfect. So you ask them to sit there and think for another hour. But this time you pump in some Mozart music. After all, he's supposed to make us think better. At the end of that hour, you ask the team members what they came up with, and they give you another 4 tasks. Again, the sprint is now better planned, but at what cost? You've kept the team locked up another 2 hours. I contend that's not worth it. Perfect sprint planning does not mean the team has thought of every task. Perfect sprint planning means the team has perfectly figured out what set of product backlog items they can do during the sprint. Think about that for a moment and let it sink in. Being perfect is not thinking of every task. Being perfect is knowing the right set of product backlog items that can be delivered in a sprint. To do that, the team does not need to think of every task. They need to think of the big things, but not everything. In my experience, a team doing a good job of sprint planning will identify only about 2/3 of all the tasks its members will do during the sprint. In other words, the team leaves the meeting having failed to identify about 1/3 of all the tasks that will be done during the sprint. And I contend this is a good thing. The team could stay longer and identify more of the work, but it's not worth the extra time. Now notice I said the team fails to identify 1/3 of the tasks, not 1/3 of the hours. The tasks that are not identified tend to be the smaller tasks. We don't miss the big to-dos, just the little ones. So the number of hours of work not identified will be less than 1/3. If you're a Scrum Master, I encourage you to know the percentage of tasks your team identifies during sprint planning. This is an easy metric to collect. Simply count the number of tasks identified during sprint planning, and then count the number of tasks that have been identified by the end of the sprint. Divide, and that will tell you the percentage your team is identifying during sprint planning. If you find your team is identifying more than 2/3 during sprint planning, first congratulate them on doing such a great job of identifying work that needs to be done. Then, try shortening their sprint planning meetings. They can probably get by with spending a bit less time in sprint planning. On the other hand, if you do the math and find your team is only identifying 50% of the eventual tasks during sprint planning, your team will probably benefit from spending a bit more time in the sprint planning meeting. The team is underestimating the effort required to complete the product backlog items, which means they are probably bringing in more work than they can deliver. There could be other forces at work here causing the team to be unable to identify a higher percentage of tasks. Perhaps they aren't adequately prepared for the sprint planning meeting. Perhaps the product owner is changing what's needed to deliver the product backlog item. Perhaps we don't have the right people participating in the sprint planning meeting. But most often, when a team routinely identifies much less than 2/3 of the tasks needed, that team will benefit from spending a bit more time in sprint planning. Sprint planning is designed to help the team select the right set of product backlog items to bring into the sprint. The team members should discuss each item just enough to know how they will implement it, and therefore whether or not they have enough bandwidth to complete that item in this sprint. The right amount of time, then, is just enough to correctly choose a set of product backlog items that can be completed during the sprint. By knowing the percentage of tasks your team identifies during sprint planning, and by remaining focused on the true purpose of sprint planning, selecting the right set of product backlog items to bring into a sprint, and discussing them just enough to successfully implement them, you can help your team find the right amount of time it should spend in sprint planning.